Have you ever noticed how some stories pull you in immediately? Not because they're proven, not because they're logical, but because they feel like they explain something you couldn't quite put into words. Not facts, not evidence, but a feeling that something about the world doesn't fully add up. Tonight, I want to slow things down with you and look at why conspiracy theories feel so compelling, not from a place of judgment or ridicule, but from inside the human mind itself. Not why people are wrong, but why these stories feel right when uncertainty gets heavy, when trust feels thin, and when simple explanations no longer seem to fit the weight of what's happening around us. There is a particular kind of tension that appears when the mind is left without an explanation. A quiet pressure that does not shout or panic at first, but slowly settles into the background of thought and refuses to leave. It emerges most clearly when events feel important yet unresolved, when something affects our safety, our future, or our sense of order, and no clear answer arrives to contain it. In those moments, uncertainty does not feel neutral. It feels intrusive, as if something unfinished has entered the room and taken a seat without asking permission. The human mind was never designed to remain open-ended for long. From an early age, we learn to associate understanding with safety, not because every explanation is accurate, but because explanations reduce tension. Knowing why something happened gives the nervous system a place to rest. Even a painful answer can feel more tolerable than none at all, because pain with meaning is easier to carry than confusion without boundaries. This is where the appeal of conspiracy theories quietly begins, not with gullibility or ignorance, but with discomfort. When official explanations feel thin, delayed, or emotionally unsatisfying, the mind does what it has always done when faced with ambiguity. It starts searching for structure. It looks for intention, for causality, for something that transforms randomness into a narrative that can be followed from beginning to end. Uncertainty creates a unique kind of anxiety because it cannot be negotiated with. Fear can be confronted, grief can be processed, anger can be expressed, but uncertainty lingers without offering a clear direction. It asks the mind to wait, and waiting is something the human psyche struggles to do, especially when the stakes feel high. In that waiting space, imagination begins to work harder than logic, because imagination is faster, more flexible, and less constrained by evidence. A conspiracy theory enters this space like a piece of furniture placed inside an empty room. It gives the mind something solid to move around, something to lean against, something that reduces the echo of unanswered questions. Even if the furniture is poorly made, even if it collapses under scrutiny, its presence alone can feel stabilizing in the moment. The mind is often less concerned with whether an explanation is true than with whether it is complete. There is also a deeper psychological layer beneath this discomfort, one tied to the way humans relate to randomness itself. Randomness implies a lack of intention, and a lack of intention can feel threatening. If events happen without purpose, then outcomes become unpredictable, and unpredictability makes the future feel unsafe. A conspiracy theory removes randomness from the equation. It insists that nothing is accidental, that someone is always deciding, always planning, always directing outcomes from behind the scenes. This belief, paradoxically, can feel reassuring. A world controlled by hidden forces may be unfair or corrupt, but it is still a world with rules. It still follows a logic, even if that logic is malicious. A world governed by chance offers no such comfort. In that sense, conspiracy theories often function less as beliefs about reality and more as emotional tools designed to make uncertainty survivable. Another reason uncertainty feels so uncomfortable is that it exposes vulnerability. Not knowing places the individual in a position of dependence, relying on external sources for clarity, guidance, or protection. For people who already feel powerless, dismissed, or overlooked, this dependence can feel humiliating. A conspiracy theory offers an escape from that position by reframing ignorance as insight. The person is no longer waiting for answers. They already have them. In this way, uncertainty does not merely create anxiety, it threatens identity. To admit not knowing is to admit limitation, and limitation can feel dangerous in a culture that values certainty, confidence, and control. Conspiracy theories offer an alternative identity, one where doubt is rebranded as awareness, and confusion is reframed as skepticism. The discomfort of not knowing is transformed into the comfort of believing one has seen through the illusion. There is also the social dimension of uncertainty, which often goes unnoticed. When large groups of people face unanswered questions, silence can feel like abandonment. If institutions, authorities, or experts fail to communicate clearly, the absence of explanation can feel like neglect or deception, even when it is not. In that gap, alternative narratives spread, not because they are more accurate, but because they are more present. They speak when others remain quiet. The mind tends to trust the voice that fills the silence first. This is not a flaw in intelligence, but a feature of psychological survival. Silence invites speculation, and speculation quickly becomes belief when repeated often enough. Once an explanation takes root, it begins to organize perception around itself, filtering new information through its assumptions. What began as a response to uncertainty slowly becomes a framework through which reality is interpreted. It is important to notice that none of this requires malice or manipulation at the individual level. Most people do not seek conspiracy theories because they want to reject reality. They seek them because reality feels incomplete. They want coherence, continuity, and reassurance that the world still makes sense, even if that sense is dark or unsettling. The discomfort of not knowing is not a weakness, it is a signal. It reveals how deeply the human mind depends on narrative to function. We live inside stories, whether we acknowledge them or not, and when the official story feels fragmented, impersonal, or emotionally hollow, the mind begins to write its own. Conspiracy theories are one of the ways the mind fills in the blanks, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. They are attempts to soothe the tension created by unanswered questions, to reduce the anxiety of uncertainty, and to regain a sense of orientation in a world that feels increasingly complex and distant. Before judging why people believe these stories, it is worth sitting with the discomfort they are trying to escape. Because beneath every conspiracy theory lies the same quiet unease, the feeling that not knowing is more frightening than believing something, anything that makes the chaos feel whole again. The human brain does not encounter the world as a collection of isolated facts. It encounters it as movement, repetition, contrast, and rhythm. Long before language, before logic, before structured reasoning, the mind learned to survive by noticing what tends to appear together and what usually follows what. A shadow after a sound, a storm after certain clouds, danger after certain signs. Pattern recognition was never a hobby of the mind. It was a survival requirement. That instinct still operates beneath modern thought, quietly and continuously, even when it no longer serves the same purpose. The brain scans for coherence, not because it wants to be right, but because it wants to be prepared. It would rather assume a connection that does not exist than miss one that does. From an evolutionary perspective, false positives were often safer than false negatives. Seeing a pattern where none exists is less costly than failing to see one that does. This tendency becomes especially active when events feel emotionally charged. When something threatens safety, stability, or identity, the brain increases its sensitivity, searching harder for signals, connections, and explanations. Neutral randomness feels intolerable in these moments. The mind begins to pull threads together, even if those threads were never meant to meet. Conspiracy theories fit naturally into this pattern-seeking machinery. They present themselves not as isolated claims, but as networks. One event leads to another. One decision connects to a larger plan. Separate incidents are woven into a single narrative fabric. To a pattern-hungry brain, this feels satisfying. The world begins to look organized again, no longer scattered or incoherent. What makes this especially compelling is that the brain does not experience pattern recognition as imagination. It experiences it as discovery. When connections are formed, they feel revealed, not invented. The emotional response that follows, the subtle sense of clarity or insight, reinforces the belief that something real has been uncovered. The mind rewards itself for finding order, even if the order is constructed rather than observed. Modern life intensifies this tendency. We are exposed to vast amounts of information without clear hierarchy or context. News, images, opinions, and events arrive continuously, often disconnected from one another. The brain, overwhelmed by volume, looks for shortcuts. Patterns become a way to compress complexity into something manageable. A conspiracy theory offers a simplified structure that makes the noise feel navigable. There is also an aesthetic dimension to patterns that is often overlooked. Patterns feel elegant. They feel intentional. They give the impression that reality has design rather than drift. For many people, this is deeply comforting. A chaotic world suggests indifference. A patterned world suggests purpose, even if that purpose is hostile. The mind often prefers a meaningful enemy to a meaningless void. Once a pattern is perceived, it becomes self-reinforcing. New information is no longer evaluated on its own terms, but in relation to the existing structure. Details that fit the pattern are noticed and remembered. Details that contradict it are dismissed as exceptions, lies, or distractions. This is not deliberate dishonesty. It is cognitive economy. The brain conserves energy by protecting the structure it has already built. Over time, the pattern becomes more important than the evidence that originally supported it. The narrative itself begins to feel obvious, even inevitable. Questioning it feels uncomfortable, not because it is threatening to truth, but because it threatens coherence. To dismantle the pattern would mean returning to uncertainty, fragmentation, and cognitive strain. There is also a subtle emotional reward embedded in pattern discovery. Finding connections creates a sense of competence. It feels like mental mastery, like seeing beneath the surface while others remain distracted by appearances. This reward strengthens attachment to the pattern, making it harder to let go even when contradictions arise. Importantly, this process is not limited to conspiracy thinking. It is the same mechanism that allows humans to learn languages, understand social dynamics, and anticipate consequences. The difference lies not in the mechanism itself, but in the context in which it operates. When reliable information is scarce or trust is low, pattern recognition drifts away from reality and towards speculation. The brain does not ask whether a pattern is healthy. It asks whether it reduces uncertainty. And conspiracy theories are extremely efficient at doing exactly that. They take scattered events and lock them into a single explanatory frame. They transform coincidence into coordination and ambiguity into intention. Understanding this does not require judgment. It requires recognition of how deeply the human mind depends on structure. The attraction to conspiracy theories is not a rejection of reason. It is reason operating under emotional pressure, using the tools it has always used to make sense of the unknown. In moments when the world feels too complex to hold all at once, patterns become anchors. They give the mind something to grasp, something that feels solid in an otherwise shifting landscape. And even when those anchors are illusory, the relief they provide can feel real enough to keep holding on. There is a quiet fear that appears when people realize how little control they actually have. It does not arrive as panic or dread, but as a slow erosion of certainty, a subtle sense that life is happening faster than understanding can keep up with. Systems change, rules shift, crises emerge without warning, and decisions made far away ripple into personal lives without explanation. In that atmosphere, instability is not dramatic, it is exhausting. Human psychology depends heavily on the belief that actions lead to predictable outcomes. Even when life is difficult, the idea that effort, caution, or intelligence can influence results gives the mind a sense of footing. When that belief weakens, anxiety fills the gap. A world that cannot be influenced begins to feel hostile, not because it is cruel, but because it is indifferent. This is where conspiracy theories quietly become appealing. They do not simply explain events, they restore a sense of structure. They suggest that behind confusion there is intention, behind disorder there is design, and behind instability there is someone making decisions. Even when those decisions are framed as malicious, the existence of intention itself can feel grounding. Randomness is psychologically unsettling because it denies agency. If outcomes are accidental, then preparation loses meaning. If events are arbitrary, then foresight becomes irrelevant. The mind resists this idea because it undermines the belief that vigilance matters. A conspiracy theory removes randomness from the equation. It replaces chance with coordination, accident with agenda. This replacement creates an illusion of control, but an illusion that feels emotionally real. If events are planned, then they can be understood. If they can be understood, then they can be anticipated. Even if one cannot stop what is happening, simply believing there is a logic behind it reduces helplessness. The mind shifts from feeling lost to feeling oriented. There is an important distinction here between actual control and perceived control. Psychological stability relies far more on the latter. People can endure immense hardship if they believe they understand why it is happening and what it means. Conversely, even mild disruptions can feel unbearable when they seem arbitrary and unexplained. Conspiracy theories function as meaning-making systems that protect perceived control when real control is absent. Modern life intensifies this need. Many individuals feel disconnected from decision-making processes that shape their lives. Economic shifts, technological changes, political decisions, and global crises often feel abstract and inaccessible. The scale of these forces makes personal influence feel insignificant. In response, the mind searches for explanations that shrink complexity into something graspable. A conspiracy theory often does this by personalizing power. Instead of impersonal systems, it introduces actors. Instead of diffuse causes, it assigns responsibility. This personalization makes power feel more comprehensible. It transforms an overwhelming structure into a story with characters, motives, and strategies. The world becomes legible again. There is also an emotional component tied to blame. When outcomes are negative and no clear cause is visible, frustration accumulates. Conspiracy theories provide a target for that frustration. They give anger a direction and fear a face. This does not resolve the underlying problem, but it relieves emotional pressure by externalizing distress. For some, this sense of regained control becomes deeply tied to identity. Rejecting the conspiracy narrative would mean returning to a position of vulnerability, where events feel unpredictable and influence feels minimal. Holding onto the belief becomes a way of protecting psychological stability rather than asserting factual accuracy. It is also worth noting that control does not always mean safety. Many conspiracy theories depict dangerous forces, secret elites, or hostile agendas. Yet even these narratives can feel preferable to uncertainty. Danger with intention feels negotiable. Chaos without intention feels overwhelming. The mind would rather prepare for a threat than surrender to randomness. This dynamic explains why contradictory evidence often fails to dissolve conspiracy beliefs. The belief is not primarily serving a logical function. It is serving an emotional one. Removing it without replacing the sense of control it provides can feel like pulling away a support structure. The mind resists, not because it is blind, but because it is protecting equilibrium. In environments where trust has eroded, this process accelerates. When official explanations feel incomplete or dismissive, they fail to restore control. Alternative narratives step in to fill that role. The issue is not simply misinformation, it is unmet psychological need. Understanding this reframes conspiracy thinking in a quieter, more human way. It is not always an act of rebellion or ignorance. Often, it is an attempt to cope with a world that feels too large, too fast, and too indifferent. It is a way of saying that things happen for reasons, even when those reasons are unsettling. Control, in this context, is less about power and more about orientation. It is about knowing where one stands, what forces are at play, and how the future might unfold. Conspiracy theories offer a map, even if that map is flawed. And for a mind navigating instability, a flawed map can feel better than none at all. As long as the world continues to feel unpredictable and distant, the desire for hidden explanations will persist. Not because people crave deception, but because they crave something steadier than uncertainty. Something that allows them to believe the world is still operating under rules, even if those rules are hidden from view. There is a subtle emotional shift that happens when someone begins to believe they have seen something others have not. It does not arrive as arrogance at first. It arrives as relief. A sense that confusion has finally settled into clarity, that scattered impressions have aligned into a single perspective that explains not only events, but people as well. The world feels less noisy when it can be divided into those who see and those who do not. Conspiracy theories often offer this division quietly, without stating it outright. They suggest that truth is hidden, that reality operates beneath the surface, and that only a few are willing or able to look closely enough to notice. For someone who has felt overlooked, dismissed, or powerless, this idea can be deeply affirming. Awareness becomes a form of value. Insight becomes a substitute for influence. Feeling awake is not just about knowledge. It is about identity. To believe one has awakened is to believe one has crossed a threshold, leaving behind naivety, manipulation, or blindness. This belief transforms uncertainty into a journey and doubt into initiation. The individual is no longer merely confused. They are becoming someone who understands. This is particularly compelling in environments where people feel invisible or unheard. When personal experiences are invalidated or ignored, discovering a hidden explanation can feel like reclaiming agency. The conspiracy narrative does not just explain the world. It explains why the individual feels out of place within it. Others are asleep. That is why they do not notice. That is why they dismiss concerns. That is why they seem complacent. This framing creates a powerful emotional buffer against social rejection. Criticism no longer signals error. It signals blindness in others. Disagreement is no longer threatening. It becomes confirmation. The more resistance a belief encounters, the more it appears to validate the idea that truth is being suppressed. There is also a deep comfort in belonging to a small group defined by awareness rather than status. Conspiracy communities often form around shared interpretation rather than shared background. People who feel isolated in their daily lives may find connection through mutual suspicion and shared insight. The bond is not built on trust in the world, but trust in each other's perception. This sense of belonging can be stronger than factual accuracy because it fulfills a fundamental psychological need. Humans are social creatures, and identity is shaped not only by what we believe, but by who believes alongside us. To question the belief would be to risk exclusion, not just from an idea, but from a community that offers recognition and validation. Feeling awake also introduces a moral dimension. Those who see themselves as aware often feel a sense of responsibility, even superiority, not necessarily in a cruel way, but in a protective one. They may feel compelled to warn others, to expose hidden forces, to resist manipulation. This role provides purpose. It transforms passive anxiety into active vigilance. The problem arises when this identity becomes rigid. Once awareness is tied to self-worth, any challenge to the belief feels personal. Evidence against the narrative is not just contradictory, it is insulting. It threatens the foundation of how the individual understands themselves and their place in the world. At this point, conspiracy thinking becomes less about information and more about self-protection. The belief is no longer held tentatively, it is held defensively. Letting go would not simply mean changing one's mind. It would mean losing the sense of being awake, of being different, of being someone who understands what others cannot. This dynamic explains why debates around conspiracy theories often feel emotionally charged rather than rational. The conversation is not about facts alone. It is about identity, belonging, and meaning. One side feels they are defending truth. The other feels they are defending stability. Both feel misunderstood. It is important to recognize that the desire to feel awake is not inherently pathological. Curiosity, skepticism, and critical thinking are essential. The issue arises when skepticism becomes a fixed identity rather than a flexible tool. When awareness becomes a badge rather than a process, it stops serving understanding and starts serving ego protection. Conspiracy theories often exploit this shift by framing doubt as weakness and belief as courage. To question the narrative is to risk being labeled naive or controlled. To accept it is to join the ranks of the aware. This framing discourages reflection and rewards certainty, even when that certainty is built on fragile foundations. Feeling awake while others sleep offers clarity, belonging, and purpose in a world that often feels indifferent. It replaces confusion with identity and isolation with community. And for many, that emotional structure is far more compelling than the messy, uncomfortable task of living with unanswered questions. Understanding this does not require ridicule or dismissal. It requires recognizing how deeply humans long to feel seen, significant, and oriented within the world. Conspiracy theories meet that longing by offering not just explanations, but a role to inhabit, one where awareness itself becomes a form of refuge. Let me talk to you for a moment, not as someone explaining a theory, but as someone standing in the same uncertainty you are. Because this doesn't start with suspicion, and it doesn't start with rebellion either. It starts with a feeling that's hard to name, a soft hesitation that appears when an explanation feels finished too quickly, when something important is wrapped up neatly while your own experience still feels unresolved. You and I don't wake up one day deciding we can't trust what we're told. Trust doesn't collapse like a building. It thins out little by little through moments that seem insignificant at the time. A statement that avoids the part you were actually worried about. A correction that arrives quietly after confidence was shown loudly. A sense that questions are being managed instead of answered. None of this feels dramatic, but it leaves a mark. And after enough of those moments, something inside us shifts. We start listening differently, not aggressively, not cynically, just more carefully. We hear the words, but we also hear what's missing. We notice when complexity is flattened, when uncertainty is spoken about as if it were weakness, when reassurance comes before understanding. Without realizing it, we step back a little. I think that's where conspiracy theories begin for many of us, not in anger, but in distance, when the world starts to feel like it's speaking past you instead of with you. You begin looking elsewhere for meaning. Not because you want something extreme, but because you want something that acknowledges the confusion you're already carrying. You and I live in a time where information moves fast, but trust moves slowly. We're given conclusions, summaries, and official versions, but rarely invited into the thinking behind them. When something doesn't make sense, we're often told not to worry, rather than help to understand. And being told not to worry doesn't dissolve doubt. It teaches it to stay quiet. Once trust weakens, every explanation starts to pass through a different filter. You don't just ask whether something's true anymore. You ask whether the person saying it understands how it feels to live with the consequences of it. You listen for empathy as much as accuracy. And when empathy is missing, even correct information can feel hollow. This is why alternative stories start to feel attractive. A conspiracy theory doesn't begin by giving you answers. It begins by validating your discomfort. It says, something feels off and you're not imagining that. For someone who's been feeling talked over or simplified, that recognition alone can feel grounding. It feels like someone is finally sitting in the confusion with you instead of rushing past it. And slowly, without noticing, trust shifts from institutions to narratives, from official voices to stories that feel more emotionally complete. These stories may be flawed, exaggerated, or false, but they do something important. They fill the silence. They give shape to uncertainty. They turn vague unease into something that feels explainable. You and I are not drawn to these stories because we hate truth. We're drawn to them because truth, as it's often delivered, feels distant from lived experience. We want explanations that don't just close the conversation, but stay open long enough to feel real. When that doesn't happen, the mind looks for meaning wherever it can find it. At a certain point, trust becomes less about facts and more about relationship. It's no longer just, is this correct? It becomes, do I feel understood here? And once that question enters the room, belief changes its shape. Accuracy alone is no longer enough to hold it. This is why simply correcting someone rarely works. If you feel unheard, being corrected feels like being managed again. It feels like someone trying to fix the surface without touching the fracture underneath. And fractures don't heal that way. When trust slips away, imagination steps in to do what reassurance couldn't. It connects dots, assigns motives, and builds stories that feel more personal than abstract systems ever could. These stories aren't born from a desire to reject reality. They're born from a desire to feel oriented again, to feel that the world is speaking in a language that makes sense to your experience. So if we want to understand why conspiracy theories feel convincing, we have to stop asking only what people believe and start asking where trust quietly faded. Because belief doesn't grow in isolation. It grows in the space left behind when understanding disappears. And until that space is acknowledged, not dismissed, the stories that fill it will continue to feel necessary. And maybe the most uncomfortable part is this. If you and I are honest, we can see how easily we could end up there too. Not because we're careless, but because we're human. And we all need to feel that the world is still speaking to us, not just about us. Let me say this carefully, because it matters more than we usually admit. You and I like to think that we believe things because they are true, because they are proven, because they make sense. But most of the time, belief begins somewhere much quieter. It begins with how something feels long before it ever becomes a conclusion. There are moments when a story reaches us and immediately settles into place, not because we've examined it deeply, but because it fits an emotion we were already carrying. Fear finds a reason to exist. Anger finds a direction. Suspicion finds a shape. And when that happens, the story feels right in a way that logic alone rarely achieves. You and I don't experience the world as raw data. We experience it through our nervous system, through memory, through mood, through everything that has already happened to us. When something confirms what we've been feeling beneath the surface, the mind relaxes. It stops questioning. It says, "This explains it. This finally makes sense." Conspiracy theories often work at this emotional level first. They don't start by persuading you intellectually. They start by resonating with something you already feel but haven't fully articulated. a sense that things are unfair, a sense that someone is lying, a sense that ordinary explanations are too small to hold the weight of what's happening. When a story gives those feelings a narrative, it feels convincing in a way facts alone rarely do. This is where emotional truth quietly overtakes factual truth. Emotional truth is not about accuracy, it's about coherence. It asks one question above all else. Does this story explain how I feel? And when the answer is yes, the mind treats the story gently, protectively, even when parts of it don't hold up under scrutiny. You and I do this more often than we realize. When we feel wronged, we accept explanations that assign blame more easily than ones that suggest complexity. When we feel afraid, we prefer stories that name a threat rather than ones that admit uncertainty. When we feel powerless, we gravitate toward narratives that reveal hidden control because they make our fear feel justified instead of vague. The mind is not broken for doing this. It is efficient. Emotions are fast. They help us make sense of situations before careful reasoning has time to catch up. But speed comes at a cost. Once a belief is anchored emotionally, evidence becomes secondary. Facts are no longer evaluated on their own. They are evaluated based on whether they support or threaten the feeling underneath. This is why arguing with facts often feels pointless. You and I aren't just defending an idea when we hold onto certain beliefs. We're defending a feeling that helped us organize chaos. To remove the belief without addressing the emotion beneath it feels like pulling away the floor while asking someone to keep standing. Conspiracy theories often survive because they offer emotional clarity in a confusing world. They don't say things are complicated and uncertain. They say, here is why you feel uneasy, and here is who is responsible. That clarity can feel like relief. It turns a diffuse emotional weight into something contained, something named. Once that happens, doubt feels uncomfortable. Questioning the story means reopening the emotional wound it helped close. So the mind protects the belief, not aggressively, but instinctively. Contradictory information starts to feel irritating, suspicious, or even hostile, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens emotional balance. You and I should also notice how often emotional truth feels more honest than official explanations. A statement can be factually correct and still feel empty if it ignores fear, grief, or anger. When people say, "This doesn't explain how it feels," they're not rejecting reality. They're pointing to a gap between information and experience. Conspiracy theories rush to fill that gap. They speak in emotional language. They acknowledge tension, injustice, and betrayal. Even when their claims are exaggerated or false, they feel alive in a way sterile explanations do not. And that aliveness can be mistaken for truth. This doesn't mean emotions are the enemy. Without them, nothing would matter. But when emotions become the sole filter for belief, they begin to rewrite reality to match themselves. What feels true becomes more important than what can be tested. And once that shift happens, belief hardens. If you and I are honest, we can see how easily this could happen to us too. All it takes is sustained stress, unanswered questions, and the feeling that no one is really listening. In that state, a story that validates emotion will always sound more convincing than one that asks for patience. Understanding this changes how we see conspiracy thinking. It's not just about misinformation. It's about unmet emotional needs. It's about feelings searching for a story strong enough to hold them. And until those feelings are acknowledged, not dismissed, logic alone will always arrive too late. Because before we believe something with our minds, we believe it with our nervous systems. And once a belief feels emotionally true, letting go of it is not an intellectual act. It is an emotional one. Let me end this by coming back to something simple, something you and I do every day without noticing. We turn life into stories. Not because we're dramatic, not because we're avoiding reality, but because stories are how we stay oriented inside complexity. They give events a beginning, a middle, and a reason to exist instead of floating past us like noise. When something overwhelming happens, especially on a scale that feels distant and impersonal, it's hard to hold it as raw information. Numbers don't stay with us. Systems don't comfort us. Processes don't explain how it feels to wake up uncertain about the future. So, the mind does what it has always done. It personalizes. It narrates. It turns chaos into something that can be understood, even if that understanding is imperfect. Conspiracy theories work so well because they do exactly this. They take abstract forces and give them faces. They take confusion and give it intention. They take randomness and replace it with motive. Suddenly, the world feels less cold. Something is happening for a reason, even if that reason is unsettling. And strangely, that can feel more bearable than accepting that some things happen without meaning at all. You and I struggle more with meaninglessness than with fear. Fear can be prepared for. Fear can be explained. But meaninglessness leaves us with nowhere to stand. A conspiracy theory removes that emptiness. It says, this matters, this was planned, this connects to something larger. It pulls you back into the story instead of leaving you outside it. There is also something deeply human about wanting to feel involved. When events shape our lives without our input, we feel reduced to spectators. Stories bring us back into participation. Even believing that we understand what's really going on gives a sense of presence, of not being entirely passive. It feels like standing closer to the center instead of watching from the edges. That's why these beliefs can be so resilient. They don't just explain the world, they give us a role inside it. Someone who sees, someone who understands, someone who isn't completely lost. Letting go of that role doesn't just mean changing a belief. It means stepping back into uncertainty, into not knowing where you stand again. If you and I are honest, we can admit how uncomfortable that is. Not knowing is vulnerable. It requires patience, humility, and trust in things that often feel undeserving of it. Stories, even flawed ones, protect us from that discomfort. They hold us together when reality feels too large to process all at once. So when we ask why people like conspiracy theories, maybe the quieter answer is this. They help us live with a world that doesn't always make sense. They offer meaning where clarity is missing. They give shape to fear, direction to anger, and coherence to chaos. Understanding this doesn't mean we have to accept false stories as true. But it does mean we can stop treating belief as stupidity and start seeing it as coping. Because behind every attempt to explain the world, even the distorted ones, is the same human need you and I share. To feel oriented, to feel included, to feel that life somehow still forms a story we can survive inside.